I'm Dave. Welcome to my shop. I'm Dave Plummer, a retired operating systems engineer from Microsoft going back to the MS-DOS and Windows 95 days, and I just happen to be the programmer that ported the Space Cadet pinball game that came included with Windows. And today, I spoke with a developer at Microsoft who ultimately removed it from Windows to find out why that was done, as well as to learn the prospects of it ever making a return. I'll tell you both sides of that story, and then I'll show you how to get Pinball up and running on Windows 10 in just moments. Finally, we'll test drive it all on a new Windows 11 to see if it still works there some 25 years later. If it does, I'll reveal the secret cheat code that's been left in Pinball to give you super user-like powers within the game. Now, I want to be very clear that I take no credit for the graphics, the sound, the table design, the gameplay, the original code even, none of it. It all existed as far back as a Maxis game called Full Tilt Pinball that came out years beforehand. My claim to fame is that I took a game that comparatively few would have ever otherwise heard of, and then I ported it to a platform that would ultimately have more than 1 billion users. They'd all get a copy included for free, and it soon became a formative part of most millennials' childhoods. They say success has many fathers, but I'm content just to be the fun uncle who brought the game to the masses by volunteering to make it all work originally on Windows NT 4.0. The year was 1995, and I was busy working on the port of the Win95 shell over to Windows NT. Now, the shell includes the start menu, the desktop, icons, folder views, common controls, common dialogues, most of the UI that you actually see. Our vice president, Jim Alchin, apparently wanted to include something in the Windows NT box that would showcase the new graphics and sound APIs that were being included for the very first time. What better way to do so than to include a game that looked cool, sounded cool, and was even fun to play? It couldn't help but to improve the somewhat stodgy image that some folks had of Windows NT at the time. Like Solitaire before it, it would eventually become a nearly ubiquitous symbol of the operating systems that it shipped with. One day, while I was working on porting the shell, my manager came to me to ask if I would be interested in porting a pinball game from Windows 95 to Windows NT. Sounded simple enough, but I already knew that sometimes moving code from 95 to NT could be challenging depending on how it was written and what APIs it relied on. Still, I agreed simply because I loved games, and so I jumped at the chance to actually work on one again and get paid to do it. My primary specialty on the shell team was the handling of issues related to the MIPS RISC processor, meaning that while we collectively worked to get the Win95 shell working on Windows NT, it was my job specifically to deal with anything that popped up related to the MIPS. Back in those days, Windows ran on multiple non-Intel architectures, including the MIPS RISC, the PowerPC, and the Alpha AXP. You could buy a version of Windows specially compiled for each one. On our team, each processor had a specialist assigned to deal with issues that were unique to that platform, and I was the MIPS guy. In fact, I didn't even have an x86 on my desk at work and ran NT351 on a MIPS machine as my primary dev box. I went straight from the 486 to the MIPS, skipping over the Intel Pentium entirely. Now, by and large, once you had code working on one of the RISC chips, it would probably work on them all, but just getting that far could be challenging because those chips all require that their data be aligned on 32-bit boundaries. In the land of x86, however, you know how the song goes. Everybody's sacred, everybody's great, if a byte is wasted, Bill gets quite irate. All right, no, nobody ever really said that, but most x86 code does tightly pack its variables in on byte boundaries, which just doesn't work on RISC. The long and short of it, however, is that if I got the game working on my MIPS box, it probably would pretty much work anywhere. There were just a few problems, however. First, the code was rather opaque in places. It wasn't code written in-house by us, it was game code that Microsoft had bought from someone, and it wasn't written in the style to which I had become accustomed, let's say. Game code really often isn't because it's often single version code. Whereas with an operating system, it's version after version built one atop another, many games are one and done affairs where code maintainability and readability aren't always top priorities relative to being really fast and shipping really soon. The big uh-oh moment came when I looked at the code for the sound engine. Now, it's not that there's anything wrong with the code. I'm sure it was perfectly cromulent x86 assembly, but x86 code did me very little good on the MIPS, the PowerPC, and the Alpha. An operating system like Windows is 99.99% or more C and C++ with almost nothing in assembly outside the hardware abstraction layer and maybe some boot code. After all, when you're targeting nearly half a dozen processor architectures, you don't want to have to hand code assembly for each of them. You want to write it once in C and be done with it. To make this work, I was going to have to rip out the assembly language code and replace it all with freshly written C code that could then be compiled to the native code for each platform. By happy coincidence, a month or two prior, I had met with the MS Arcade team to review their implementation of the old Atari arcade game known as Tempest, which I was the world champion on. That gave me a bit of an in with those guys, so I called them up, and as soon as they could, they sent me some demo code written in C that did some sound work. Between following along with what the assembly did originally and looking at how the C sample worked, I was able to build a new sound engine in C++ that worked across all of our processors. Pretty soon I had the game up and running well enough to start testing it, and to be honest, it was kind of cool to get paid to play pinball at work. Soon enough, however, it was done and time to move on to other projects. I didn't think of pinball much until maybe 10 years later when I was volunteering at my son's school to help the little kids with their computer lab. I came across a kid playing pinball instead of working on his actual assignment. In talking to him, he asked me if I'd ever played it. I responded, not only had I played it, I worked on it at Microsoft. Up until that point, none of the kids were impressed by anything I'd worked on it. Because, let's face it, when you're in kindergarten, Task Manager is probably what your dad uses to fix the computer when you're crying like a baby because your Bob the Builder CD is locked up. Kids don't use Task Manager until usually 7 or 8 years old, so usually the little kids weren't familiar with much of anything I'd worked on. But pinball was different. They all knew and loved pinball. It seemed that for a lot of kids, pinball was the game they played because it was the only game available. That doesn't mean it wasn't a great game, it just means it was truly ubiquitous because it was built into Windows itself. You could plunk down a pretty much any Windows PC and you could find it right where it should be. But not today. Now it's gone. But here's a little secret though. If you can get a hold of a copy, it still works fine. I'll show you how to install it. Before you decide to though, you should understand the reasons why it was removed from Windows in the first place. To find out what those were, I went straight to the source, Raymond Chen, a Microsoft developer who's worked on every version of Windows since the mid-90s. It turns out that just as I had been tasked with porting the game from Windows 95 x86 to Windows NT 32-bit, someone, years later, would be tasked with porting it from Windows 32-bit to Windows 64-bit, and that someone was Raymond. Whereas I had the luxury of a few weeks to work on just pinball, it was just a tiny part of Raymond's task, which was to update the entire shell for 64-bit. But pinball was being obstinate. When built for 64 bits, the collision detection just didn't work correctly. The ball would pass right through obstacles rather than bouncing off. So clearly the original code included some trickery of or dependency on being compiled 32 bits, but what? Raymond pulled in another set of eyes to debug it with him, but after some amount of time, they were no closer. When it became clear that pinball was going to become a time sink well beyond anything they had really allocated time for, they realized that the only option at that point was to pull it. And so, pull it they did. And pinball never made the transition from 32 to 64 bits. But if there's never been a 64-bit version of pinball, how can you run it on 64-bit Windows? Well, that's all thanks to WoW64. Windows runs truly natively 64 bits, and 32-bit applications run on a special Windows on Windows layer that provides 32-bit compatibility. It's much like how you used to run 16-bit Windows 3.1 apps on 32-bit Windows, just taken to the next logical step. As far as I know, when you install a fresh new copy of 64-bit Windows, you get all 64-bit binaries. There's nothing 32-bit about it, and so the WoW64 system never has to start. That means it doesn't take up time during boot, and it doesn't consume any resources. As soon as 32-bit applications are run, however, the WoW64 subsystem has to load, which takes time and resources. One could argue that pinball isn't launched at startup, so who really cares? Still, it would look weird and lame to ship that one 32-bit binary, and it would be equally weird and lame to not ship it at all on 64-bit Windows. And what if you ship the 32-bit version on the 64-bit version of Windows, but then the WoW64 layer was turned off by the user for some reason? There's just a myriad of ways in which you don't want to be shipping only one 32-bit component in a 64-bit OS. The only real solution then would be to invest the time to fix it properly. But is it worth it? Well, even I've got to say probably not, and here's why. First, the game is ancient, and while for many people it's a nostalgic thing, I don't know that younger Windows users are really clamoring for it. More important, though, it's the fact that it's highly visually dated. When you see it next to Windows 11, it's pretty jarring. You can't ship a piece of software ironically, so you'd have to fix it, which means you'd have to invest not only in a lot of debugging and coding, but also a visual restyle and reskin. It should also be resizable and scalable, which the original never was. The other argument against porting it is that it's not necessary, as the old game still runs today if you need it. I've got to caution you, however, that I'm not an attorney. It seems intuitive to me that if you own a legally licensed copy of XP and a legally licensed copy of Windows 10, that you should be able to run a component from XP on 10, but maybe the license specifically says that they're not separable for some reason. I don't know. I can't give you any legal advice because I'm not qualified to, so you have to get your own. If you do have the appropriate license for it, the binary can be found online as well, which saves you digging out your old XP CD. But be forewarned, the binaries I've seen are not signed in any way by anyone. They could be complete Trojan horses, so how can you trust them? Frankly, unless you did a binary compare or MD5 hash to verify they're the same as the CD, you can't. You're rolling the dice. I'll only experiment in an isolated VM for that reason, and if you feel compelled to follow, suggest you do it the same way. To get started, I'm going to bring up Windows 11, which I dare say is awfully pretty. It could just be because blue is my favorite color, but somehow it just feels right. To get underway, we merely have to click on the Start menu. We'll enter 3D Pinball for Windows Space Cadet. If I have a useful direct link for the download, I'll place it in the video description, so check below before hunting too far and wide on your own. And remember, I take no responsibility for what you find on the internet installed on your machine. Experiment at your own risk, as always. The binary in this case appears to be a WinRAR self-extracting archive. I don't know where this came from, but even though I've been a licensed WinRAR user for about 25 years, it sure wasn't me, and it probably wasn't anybody from Microsoft. The archive self-extractor will automatically install to your x86 program files folder in the Microsoft Games folder, where it will create a new folder called Pinball and place all the sound, graphics, and program files. That's one thing the app has going for it. No fancy setup is required. Just dump its files in a folder and go. Finally, a shortcut will be created on your desktop. When we launch the game from that desktop icon, the splash screen is initially full screen, but the actual game itself is tiny on a large monitor. It does seem to run perfectly, however. Some would say that the fact that this old app still runs without hiccup more than 25 years later is a testament to the quality of that conversion port so many years ago. Others would say it's the amazing backwards compatibility of Windows itself that makes it even possible. That's for historians to judge, not me. For now, all that matters is that Pinball still works and it plays on Windows 10. And now, maximum difficulty. Oh my goodness. That is challenging. In the code to Pinball, deep in the heart of its logic, is a piece of code that I don't think anyone fully understands. Well, Raymond probably does, but I sure didn't. It's called a state machine, and it's pretty much completely undocumented. Each time your code runs through it, the state of the machine changes, and that state is tracked in a state of variables scattered around the program. It's really hard to figure out what's going on, but it works. Earlier, I mentioned a superuser mode. That's not something that we normally do in the systems world, so Pinball contains about the only one I can think of in all of Windows. It doesn't make you a real super user, just within Pinball's actual game framework. To activate it, you enter the words hidden test with a space in between before launching the first ball. It might not be readily obvious, but now I can control the ball physics with my mouse and drag the ball around as well. There's a whole set of commands that do extra things like give you extra balls, promote you through the game ranks, add high scores, and so on. I'll put a list of those that work in the description. Now, the last thing I want to do in Windows 11 for today is show you how to move the Start menu back to the bottom left corner. I'd argue that the screen corner provides a spot where you can anchor your mouse by physical gesture. Just rank it down to the bottom left. Rank it? Yeah, like in chess. But it's really more that I'm just used to it that way. To change it, you can right-click on the taskbar and click Taskbar Settings. Once the taskbar settings come up, you'll want to select Taskbar Behaviors. Following that, you can select Taskbar Alignment and then choose Left, which will move the Start menu back down into the bottom left corner. Here's a random story about the Start menu. When I was working on it for NT4, obviously, one of the first things we had to do was to remove all the Windows 95 branding. The Start menu had a vertical Windows 95 banner running up its side. Since Windows 95 can only draw text horizontally and not vertically, it had to be a graphic for them. Windows NT, however, supports rotation of the device context, so I simply rotated my world 90 degrees and drew the Start menu and its text entirely with regular drawing APIs and no canned bitmaps. So there you go. The new Windows 11 Start menu works fine, even though I've never used it before. As a test, I did what muscle memory would have me do, and that is to launch Word. I'd press the Windows key and then type the first few letters of the program name, and up pops Word. That's about all I care about out of the box, because anything else I can probably adapt to. I'm very much trying to grow this channel, so if you found today's episode interesting or entertaining, do consider subscribing to my channel. If you know someone who used to enjoy pinball back in the day, please click the share button to send them a link. I'm not selling anything, I don't have any Patreons, I'm just in this for the subs and likes, so please consider leaving me one of each before you go. Oh wait, I am selling something, but I don't keep the money. Mugs for charity. Grab yourself a collective Dave's Garage mug from the channel store or the link in the video description. All net channel profits for calendar year 2021 are being donated to the UW Autism Center. If you're new to my channel, the two primary sets of videos you likely want to check out are the Windows War Story series and the Software Drag Racing series. The War Story series covers my time working on things like Task Manager and zip folders, as well as stories like how I secretly built Microsoft Bob into Windows XP. The Language Racing series compares the language speeds of different compilers, pitting Rust and C and Python against Perl and so on. Check it out for the sometimes surprising results. Thanks for joining me out here in the shop today. In the meantime and in between time, I hope to see you next time, right here in Dave's Garage. By happy coincidence, a month or two prior, I had met with the MS Arcade team to review their implementation of an old arcade game. By happy coincidence, a month or two prior, I had met with the MS Arcade team to review their implementation of the old Atari, to to review their implementation of the old Arcari game. Add and subtract. That gave me a bit of an in with those guys, so I called them up and soon they sent me some demo code doing a sound engine in C. So it's much like how you used to run 16-bit Windows 3.1 apps on 32-bit Windows. Wow, you're going to rush through that a little bit there, Dave. Can't even say your name. Still, it would look a little weird and lame to ship one 32-bit binary, and it would be equally weird to lay Army Hardies. They could be complete Trojan horses. How do you know? Frankly, unless you did a binary 5. I'll only experiment with them in an isolated VM for that reason, and if you follow compelled to follow... man. And now, maximum difficulty. All net channel profits for the calendar year 2021 are being donated to the UW Autism Center. UW? What is this, an episode of Grey's Anatomy where you're like an actor and you don't even know the local lingo? I don't think so.